Now, I know they didn't tell you were going to climb a mountain today, so you might not be a little prepared for that, and my apologies. But before we go, let's get a sense for how well prepared people are. So by a show of hands, has anyone climbed Mount Kilimanjaro before? One? Really? Fantastic. All right. All right. But we kind of need the rest of the folks to join us here. How about something like maybe you've run a marathon or a triathlon, or you've gone backpacking or gone on a trek? How many of you have done that? Okay, quite a bit more. All right. We're still missing quite a few people here. How about this? How many of you have faced a challenge in your life, personal or professional, that required you to dig deeper than you've ever dug before, that pushed you further than you've ever been pushed before? How many of you have faced that kind of a challenge in your life before? Fantastic. All right, so I think we're ready to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, before we leave, by the way, I should warn you, I'm actually not a professional mountain guide. All right, like you, I'm a professional. I spend my days working in front of a computer, talking on the phone. And at one point in my early career, in my late 20s, a coworker went and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. She came back from the experience and she told me about it. And at the end, she said, "You know, Dan, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro was a life-changing experience for her." Wow, that sounds pretty good. I'm not exactly sure how a pile of rocks in a developing country on the far side of the world could be life-changing, but it intrigued me. And for years, I dreamed about it. It was one of those things I just always wanted to do, and it sat there on my someday list for years. But it always seemed too big, too expensive, too time-consuming. Until one day, I met a woman. I was out on my first date with Lisa in Laguna Beach, California. After dinner, we went and had drinks, and we were sitting there talking, as you do on your first date, about our hopes and dreams for the future. And at one point, Lisa looks at me and she goes, "You know, I'd like to climb Mount Kilimanjaro someday." Me too! This is great! We have so much in common! Now, I know we're here to talk about, business success, but if I can offer you a little bit of dating advice, when you're out on your first date with someone, be very careful what you tell them you want to do. Because if you're still together 6 months later, you might have to do that thing you said you wanted to do. So what exactly had I just agreed to? I had agreed to climb the world's largest freestanding mountain, 19,340 feet above sea level in Tanzania, East Africa. For a point of reference, there's about 40% less oxygen at the top of Kilimanjaro than you and I are breathing right now. For years, I had dreamed about doing this, but for some reason, I just couldn't make it happen. One dinner with Lisa, and 6 months later, we're on our way to East Africa. Why? What changed? It wasn't a rhetorical question. What do you think changed? I'm sorry? Trying to impress a woman? There's probably a lot of truth to that. Sorry?
You're in love.
I'm in love. That could be it as well. Yeah. And I certainly wouldn't be the first guy to do something stupid to impress a woman. I want to be clear about that. But still, I can't get over this fact that I've been dreaming about it for years, and suddenly it just happened. I went backpacking and trekking with friends who were infinitely more qualified than Lisa was to go mountain climbing. As Rich pointed out, Lisa's from Hawaii. There are no famous mountain climbers from Hawaii. And as I researched this and read more and more, I think the answer lies in purpose. Purpose has become a big topic for us in our professional lives. Right? If you look at books like Good to Great and Built to Last, a purpose for a business is actually a key differentiator for those businesses that are successful and those that aren't. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? They talk about trying to attach yourself to a bigger purpose in your life. In fact, Procter & Gamble, purpose is so important for them. It's the center for their corporate strategy. Bob McDonald, the CEO, talks about purpose-inspired growth. The company's purpose is to touch and improve lives. That purpose is so important to them, it's emblazoned on almost every building that you go into for Procter & Gamble. And if I think back to that point in my life, I think most of us tend to probably have one or two purpose at work in our lives at any one point in time. And if I think back to that point in my life, I'm in my early 30s, And one purpose in my life was to be professionally successful. I was working on my career. What do you suppose that other purpose in my life might have been? I'm not a complicated guy. Get married, yeah, have a meaningful relationship, right? So now my desire to climb Mount Kilimanjaro is directly connected to a big purpose in my life, which is to have a meaningful relationship, and immediately action happens. Have you ever had the experience where you've been dreaming about something for years, suddenly everything just seems to fall into place and it starts to happen for you? I would argue on that day, you found a way to connect that bigger thing in your life to a purpose that is core to who you are and what you try to accomplish. So in terms of the mountains that you're looking to climb, those dreams that you're looking to follow, if you've been struggling to do so, I would encourage you to think about who you are and what your purpose is. Maybe your purpose is to be professionally successful. Maybe your purpose is to build a family, build a business, to grow something, to serve your community. Look for ways to tie your mountain back to that purpose. And I think you'll be surprised at how quickly you can start to see some action. So now my purpose to have a meaningful relationship is directly connected to my desire to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and we head off to East Africa. We get to the hotel and we meet Patience, the office manager, who welcomes us and talks to us about what it takes to climb Kilimanjaro. She takes us and introduces us to our guide, Mohammed. By the time we meet Mohammed, he's been climbing and taking clients up Kilimanjaro for over 12 years. Mohammed takes us to the foot of the mountain and introduces us to our porters. These are the men who are going to carry our heavy load up that mountain. Let me give you a little idea about these gentlemen here. They're going to take that basket that you see there and they're going to fill it with food, clothing, gear, equipment, shelter, and in the end it's going to weigh between 60 and 80 pounds. He's going to put that on his head. On his back he's going to carry his own clothing, so a small backpack, and he's going to hike 15 miles uphill. Some of them will do it twice in one day. Now y'all seem like a wonderful group of people. But if I had to carry 60 to 80 pounds of your stuff uphill every day, I'm not sure I would be the nicest person to be around. I've never met a group of people more eager to laugh, more anxious to smile, more warm and welcoming every day as they pass us, carrying 60 to 80 pounds up that mountain. They joke with us in the limited English that they know and the limited Swahili that we know. They share a smile. I can't think of a more ordinary job than walking uphill with a heavy load. They do it with a smile, they do it with warmth, and it becomes absolutely extraordinary. Amazing to spend 5 days on the mountain with these men, learning Swahili and learning about Tanzania. After 5 days, we make it to 15,000 feet. This will be our base camp in which we do our summit assault up to 19,000 feet. Mohammed wakes us up at midnight to start our summit assault. We step out into the darkness and we start to hike. It is at this moment that I begin to realize there's something that those IMAX movies and the National Geographic Society doesn't tell us about mountain climbing. Summiting a mountain is an incredibly, spectacularly boring experience. It is mind-numbingly boring. So think about this. For 5 days, the porters have been teaching us Swahili, right? We've been talking to each other, meeting people from all over the world here to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. There's 30% less oxygen than you and I are breathing right now. There is no scintillating conversation. It's midnight. For 5 days, we've looked out across the East African savanna. We've hiked through rainforest. It's midnight. The only thing you can see is a brown patch of dirt in front of you, illuminated by your headlamp. All you can hear is the crunching of your boots on the trail. And all you can feel is your lungs heaving as you try to take in enough oxygen to keep going. For hours. After about 2 hours of this, Lisa decides she's had enough, and she heads back down with an assistant guide. But Mohammed and I continue. We get to 17,000 feet. I'm nauseous, I'm dizzy, and I have a headache. I'm starting to feel the effects of altitude. I start to stumble. I start to fall down a little bit. I'm feeling a little confused as well. And at one point I try to ask Mohammed what's happening, but I can't quite get my mouth to articulate the words. I'm not exactly sure what I said, but Mohammed looked at me and said, "Okay." I have no idea what that meant. But we continued until we finally got to about 18,000 feet, so about 40% less oxygen than you and I are breathing right now. And the only way I can describe it is I just collapsed onto the trail from altitude sickness. As I'm laying there on the ground, off in the distance I can hear voices and footsteps coming up the trail. It turns out it's a Canadian family that's been climbing with us. John, 63 years old, he brought his son and daughter with him to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Now we can't look bad in front of the Canadians. That's not going to work. So I take a deep breath and I sit up, try to collect myself and my composure. And John comes up to me, taps me on the shoulder and says, "Dan, how you doing?" And I look up at John, and before I realize it, I say, "John, I'm thinking about going down." It didn't even occur to me that I had thought about quitting until those words came out of my mouth. He pats me on the shoulder, says, "You do what you need to do," and he keeps going. 63 years old, he's still going. Half his age and I'm lying on the ground. So here we are, we've been dreaming about Kilimanjaro for years. Mohammed tells us we're about 1,000 feet, maybe an hour or two of climbing left to get to the summit, but we're suffering from altitude sickness. What do we do? How many of you think we should keep going? By show of hands. How many of you think you should turn back? Nobody thinks you should turn back?
All right.
Oh, thank you. So I should have, maybe I'll preface this. Every year about 10 people will die on Kilimanjaro from altitude sickness, out of the 30,000 that try. Mohammed and I make the decision to go down. We go back down to 15,000 feet, we pick up all of our equipment, and then we spend another 10 miles down to about 10,000 feet. We get down to 10,000 feet, and the air feels so thick now. I feel like I could eat it. My whole body is just saturated with oxygen, and I feel fine. I don't have a headache. I'm not nauseous. I'm not dizzy. I'm not even particularly fatigued at this point. And all that energy went to one purpose and one purpose only: being really pissed off. And I'm sitting there in the tent stewing, and Lisa leans over and she kisses me on the cheek and she says, "You know, we learn more from our failures than we do our successes." That was very wise. I didn't want to hear that at that particular point in time, but that was very wise. And I think about that particularly when it comes to our business world. We always hear that mantra: failure is not an option. Failure is not an option. Why? If we're going to try to do something audacious, why is failure not an option? I would argue actually sometimes failure is an option. What might be a good option? What might be a time when failure is a good option? Either in a personal or business life.
When you're doing something stupid.
Pull back and reassess.
When you're doing something stupid, yeah, I would agree.
Just to pull back so you can reassess.
Pull back to reassess, yep. Other examples?
If it's life or death.
If it's life or death, in other words, success, okay, great, maybe I make it to the top, but if I die of altitude sickness, not such a good success, right? So I didn't fail, good on me. But yeah, so if success, for example, is actually more detrimental than failure, failure might be a better option. You ever fought hard to win a client, for example? Maybe you discounted heavily, and in the end, that client ends up costing you more money than if you had never gone after him in the first place. So congratulations, we were successful, we won the deal, but in the end, it actually was a failure for us as a business. In fact, Michael Eisner talks about that a lot. He's the gentleman who is responsible for turning around Walt Disney after 2 corporate raiders went after the company. He talks about failure as an enlightening and sober experience. In fact, success has little to teach us, he points out. I was a part of a team that launched a new product at one point. We were so excited to get this thing into market. I mean, it was really going to be amazing. We were going to change the market. We spent months building it. It looked cool. It did everything we wanted it to do. We got a retail partner involved and we showed them and they were excited about it. couldn't wait to get this thing on the shelf in a store. And so they put it on the shelf, and it just sat there. Nobody bought it. It sat there for a long time. And executives started to go walking through the store, and you started to get emails saying, geez, it looks like that shelf is really full. How are our sales doing for this exciting new product that we've been so proud on and made so much noise on? It was a colossal failure. It was an embarrassing failure. And so we did what most of us do in business. We tried to get rid of that failure as quickly as possible, right? We talked to the retailer. We said, hey, get it in the discount bins. You got to get it off that shelf. We can't keep getting phone calls from vice presidents asking us why that thing is still sitting there. And it was actually in the midst of that process that I happened to talk to a group like this, and I realized there's a second rule for failure. Failure can be a great option when we have the potential to learn from it, to pull back and reassess. We had done a project with one retailer, not the entire market, and it had failed. This was a huge learning opportunity. We thought it was going to be successful. It wasn't. Clearly we were wrong. We needed to learn. So before we pulled it off the shelf, we went in and did more research. We talked to customers, found out why it had failed. We learned a ton from that work that we would not have gotten otherwise. And it had huge implications to the entire line of products that we were selling. How many of you have had a failure in the last couple of months, right? Maybe you didn't land the client that you wanted. Maybe a meeting didn't go the way you wanted. Maybe the product didn't get out the door the way you wanted. Have you encountered some failure in the last couple of months? Yeah. I would encourage you to think for a second what you might learn from that failure. Turn around and look at it square before you begin to move on. Hard for us to do in business, particularly those public failures. But I strongly encourage you to do that. Now the good news is, I did impress the girl enough that she would marry me. But I needed to learn. I needed to understand why had I failed while so many others had succeeded. And so I started to do research into mountaineering and altitude sickness. I talked to other mountain guides, and I talked to a friend of mine who leads climbs out in California. And I told him my story, and he said, you know, the problem is you didn't fill your buckets. Okay, what does that mean? Well, in mountaineering, it takes 3 buckets to get to the top of any mountain. First is your physiology. It's what you're born with. Some of you, your bodies adjust very well to altitude. Some of you, like me, not so well. Bad news is, there is nothing we can do about that bucket. Good news is, there's still 2 other buckets. And in mountaineering, it's your physical strength and your mental strength. And you can do a lot to fill those 2 buckets. You can get physically stronger. You can work on getting mentally tougher. And that was a huge lesson for me. And I started to train with the goal of filling both of those buckets. As we started to talk, he wanted to go back to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I needed to go back to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And so I started training with a goal to fill those 2 buckets. Now if you think about that mountain that you have before you, have you done everything you can to fill the buckets you have access to? We have limitations, right? We have limitations to the market we might compete in. We have limitations to the team, company brand. Any of those things might be a limitation that you can't change, but there are other things that you can. And before you undertake one of these audacious goals, I would strongly consider looking at how you and your teams might fill those buckets. I had an interesting conversation. Many of you probably saw in the business press when Hewlett-Packard merged with Compaq. It was the largest technology merger at its time. Hugely contentious, incredibly painful for everyone involved. In hindsight, most analysts would agree actually it was the right strategy. Shortly before Carly Fiorina left Hewlett-Packard, someone asked her, what would you do differently looking back on your time in the company? And without pause, the first thing she said was, I would have prepared the company better for the merger. She had set about climbing this very big mountain and hadn't taken the time to fill those 2 buckets for the company. And it had huge impacts in how quickly the company was able to get up that mountain and successfully do so. So I started to train, prepared for that, and decided it was time to head back to Kilimanjaro. This time I'm bringing a couple friends. Lisa decides she's not going to climb. You've probably realized Lisa is the brains of the outfit at this point in time. But my friend from college, Mike, wants to climb, and he and I are talking about it over his kitchen table, and his father overhears us, and he decides he wants to join. Mike's father is a 73-year-old retired IRS auditor. So here's another little tidbit for you. If you fail miserably at something and decide you're going to go back and try it again, don't bring someone twice your age, because you know he's going to do it. We fly off to East Africa. We get to Moshi, Tanzania at the foot of the mountain, and the first person we see is Patience, the office manager who helped us last time. Patience gives me a warm hug and says, "Dan, how are you? How's Lisa?" I haven't spoken to or met with Patience in over 3 years. I meet Mohammed, gives me a warm handshake. "Dan, how are you? How's Lisa?" We head to the foot of the climb. Mick, the porter we worked with last time, Juma, Ali, Patrice, the whole team is there, and we start to climb this mountain together, along with Mike, his 73-year-old father, and a number of other gentlemen who have joined us to climb. In fact, 2 gentlemen came from California. One was a salesman for Yahoo. The other one was a writer for Nickelodeon cartoons. He wrote Darkwing Duck, by the way, if any of you might remember that one. Really interesting. Now, we were talking about training before. Their training plan is slightly different than my training plan. Their training plan, in their own words, 16-ounce curls. Not big fans of the fill your bucket strategy, as we should say. We spend 5 days climbing that mountain together. We get to 15,000 feet and it's time to head off for the summit. It's midnight. We step out into the dark and we start to hike. 17,000 feet. I'm nauseous, I'm dizzy, I have a headache. I'm starting to feel the effects of altitude. 18,000 feet, I'm nauseous, I'm dizzy, I have a headache. I'm so nauseous now I can't even drink. I can't eat any of the food that I have with me. 18,500 feet and I am just shuffling up that trail, trying to keep going. And at one point I'm shuffling along and I look down on the trail next to me. There's a body. It's my friend Mike. He looks up at me and he says, "I gotta go down. I just can't go on." And he stands up, an assistant guide helps him, and they begin to head back down. Now at this point the group has split up a little bit. So the mountain guide that joined us and some of the other folks, the faster hikers, are actually up ahead with Mohammed, and a smaller group of us is here with another guide, Mdeme. So it's Mike, his father, Darkwing Duck Boy, and myself, and one guide. So now Mike and the assistant guide are going down. That leaves Mike's dad, Darkwing Duck, and me, and one guide. And there's this rather pregnant pause as everyone sits there sizing each other up, and we realize the same thing. We now have one guide and 3 climbers. In other words, if one of us needs to go down, all 3 of us would then have to go down. But there's an assistant guide going down now. If you want to quit, now is the time. And I'm thinking about this, and it goes back to my training. Remember we talked before about filling your buckets. Well, the way I chose to fill my buckets was I started training 3 months before leaving for Kilimanjaro. Every morning I got up 2 hours early for work, and I hiked 6.5 miles to work every single morning. For the second month prior to leaving for Kilimanjaro, every morning I hiked to work, and every evening I hiked home. For the third month, every morning I hiked to work, every evening I hiked home, and on Saturday I went out and hiked 15 miles. And I still remember that first morning my alarm clock went off at about 5 o'clock in the morning. It was October, it's dark out, it's raining, and I'm sitting there here, and I turn the alarm clock off and I'm thinking, do I really have to do this? I'm looking down at that really cold tile floor, really warm comforter. And I asked myself a very simple question. Are you willing to give up the summit of Kilimanjaro for an extra hour of sleep? I think about it for a minute and I decide, no, I don't want to go back to Kilimanjaro wondering if I've done everything I can. I want to know I've done everything I can to fill my buckets. And so I get out of bed, I get dressed, and I hike out into the rain. And And I had that conversation with myself for probably about 2 weeks, every morning. Oh God, do we have to do this again? Yes, you do. Finally, after about 2 weeks, I stopped asking myself that question. The alarm went off, I got up, and I went out hiking into the dark. I was building that mental strength bucket. I realized that I had already made the choice to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I didn't need to make that same choice every single morning. That habit was starting to sink in. It was building that mental strength bucket. And as we stood there sizing each other up at 18,500 feet, finally Darkwing Duck broke the tension. He points at Mike's dad and says, well, what if the old guy needs to go down? And as I'm starting to think, this choice, if I want to quit or not, begins to form in my brain. But that mental strength energy that we'd spent so much time building kicks in. I don't need to choose to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I've already made the choice. And so I simply turned around and just kept hiking. It didn't get easier. It didn't get better. It was still incredibly hard. I would tell you one of the hardest things I've ever done in my entire life. But finally, after 3 years, I was at the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. And I think back to what it took to get there, and a big part of that is making a habit of success. So that habit of getting up and keep going, not choosing to quit, but just keep going regardless, was the habit that I had built. When Paul O'Neill took over Alcoa, one of the most failing companies in America at the time, he stood up in front of Wall Street executives and told them, we are going to be the safest company in America. Absolutely shocked Wall Street. He said, we are going to make a habit of safety at our company. We're not going to be the safest metal company, we're going to be the safest company in America. Stock price took a huge dive. And he went into his management teams and told them, we are going to make safety a habit. And he started to implement processes and habits to make his employees safer. And what they actually found was, over time, it also made them more efficient. It got both unions and managers on the same side of the table. And within 2 years, Alcoa was then one of the most successful turnarounds in American business history because of the habits that they had implemented within their company. In order for you and your teams to climb those mountains, my question for you is, can you implement any habits? I would argue, by the way, if you haven't, you might accidentally be implementing habits as well. So for example, a lot of times in sales, if a customer pushes hard, we'll discount, right? But are we building a habit of selling on price versus value? Every time a sales rep comes back to you, can you ask them, when the customer asks for a deal, did you reply with the value that we offer, for example? I talked about Procter & Gamble before. They start all of their initiative meetings by talking about the customer. How what we're about to do touches and improves the lives of the customer. They make a habit of putting the customer first so that when they're challenged by decisions, they go back to those habits. So as you think about your mountain, I would encourage you to think about what habit you might be able to implement. So we finally made it. 19,340 feet above sea level, the top of the African continent. I think back to that coworker who said climbing Kilimanjaro was a life-changing experience. She was right. For me, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro was a life-changing experience. But when I think back to that experience, I don't see the mountain. I see these guys. I remember the warmth of patience, the support of Muhammad, the sense of humor of Mick, the smile of Ali. As a result of spending weeks in Tanzania, East Africa with them, I'm more eager to laugh. I'm more anxious to smile. I'm more welcoming to strangers. I'm more willing to try new things and even potentially fail at them. I'm a better man today not because I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, but because I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with them. You've decided on a pretty audacious goal or a big challenge to overcome in your life or in your business. And I would encourage you to keep fighting at that mountain. But I would encourage you, as you climb, don't just do something extraordinary. Think about how that can also become an extraordinary experience. How that might bring your business closer together, your employees closer together, help you develop as a person or as a family. Huge opportunities for these challenges, these mountains, to be more than extraordinary achievements. And I would encourage you that these life-changing experiences, doing something extraordinary, having an extraordinary experience is usually less about the height of the mountain that you're going to climb, and it's more about the depth to which you're willing to let that mountain change you. Regardless of where your mountain takes you, regardless of how high or how small, I hope it's as positive and life-changing for you as Mount Kilimanjaro was for me. Thank you very much.